Hello everybody and welcome to another YouTube video. So in today's video, I'm going to show you the proper way to write Python code. Now when I say that, what I mean is I'm going to show you the proper Python conventions and go through the most important parts of the Python style guide, which is known as PEP8. Now, PEP8 is a very large Python style guide. I'll leave a link in the description to it. It's written by Guido, who is the inventor and creator of Python. Well, there's just a ton of things in there. Obviously, I can't cover everything, but I'll show you kind of the things that I see people making the mistake on most commonly and what I consider to be the most important things that you kind of need to know from that guideline. With that said, if you don't follow that guideline, it's not necessarily incorrect. Your code is not wrong. It just doesn't adhere to it. And some people, if you're working in maybe a large organization, for example, may be a little bit upset that you're not being consistent with how Python code should be written. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into the video after a quick word from our sponsor. Before we get started, I need to thank HarperDB for sponsoring this video. HarperDB is a hybrid SQL/NoSQL database that is accessed via a single REST API endpoint. HarperDB provides a scalable and flexible database that improves your app's performance. With the ability to run SQL on JSON data, you no longer have to pick a database based on the structure of your data. HarperDB will run anywhere and ingest any type of data at scale. With HarperDB, you can perform all CRUD database operations using only one single endpoint. You can execute SQL on JSON data and insert data via JSON, CSV, or SQL queries. HarperDB also removes the headache of database connectivity and setup by providing a geo-distributed database that improves speed, performance, and latency. HarperDB is incredibly fast, allowing one single node to handle up to 100,000 requests per second. It can also globally replicate data at the speed of the internet. To put this into perspective, HarperDB benchmarks at speeds 37 times faster than MongoDB. If you need any help along the way, HarperDB has detailed documentation and tons of customizability for more advanced developers. Thanks again to HarperDB for sponsoring this video. Spin up a free forever instance today by clicking the link in the description. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. In front of me here, you can see I have PEP8, the style guide for Python code. This is available on the Python website. It's written by Guido, and I just quickly wanted to show you what the table of contents looked like so you can see how much stuff is actually in here. So obviously I won't go through all of this. As I mentioned, I'm probably covering, 10% of what's actually in this document, but a lot of the stuff in here is just really nitpicky and something that you probably don't really need to know. Anyways, there you go. That is the guide. So what I'm going to do now is go to VS Code, which is the IDE I'm going to use for this video. And the first thing I want to show you is just how to make your life a little bit easier if you're trying to write code according to the PEP8 style guideline. So one of the main things in the PEP8 style guideline is any line cannot exceed 80 characters in Python. So to give you an example, take a look at this. I have this long function name with long arguments. Obviously, this is just an example. And if we go here and look at the bottom, we can see this has 116 characters. So really what the PEP8 guideline wants us to do is split this line up such that it only has max 80 characters on the first line. So we could do something simple like this, right? And then kind of get the indentation correct here, and then that would be fine. However, if we don't want to have to do this ourselves, what we can do is actually use a formatter, an auto formatter, where when we save our file, it will automatically fix a ton of formatting issues for us. So I'm just going to show you how to set that up quickly such that you don't have to automatically format and change the line length and do all of that kind of stuff. So if you're working in VS Code, then what you can do is start by installing an auto formatter using pip, which is called black. Now, black is probably the most popular formatter for Python, but the way you do this is pip install and then black. Now, I'm not going to exactly go through what pip is if you're not familiar with that, but try this command. If it doesn't work, you can try pip3. Pip3 should work if you're on Mac or Linux. And then if that doesn't work, you can do python-m pip install. And if that doesn't work, python3-m pip install black. All right, so once you've installed the auto formatter with pip, then if you're working in VS Code, what you're going to need to do is go to settings. So I'm going to go to settings, and then you're going to go for the Python, and this should be the format provider like that. So if you look up Python format provider, then what you're going to do is select black here. By default, you have auto PEP8, doesn't work as well as black, so I'm going to select black. And now, if you go to format here and you check the format on save, so format a file on save, so automatically format it whenever you save the file, what's going to happen when I save this file is going to auto format this line for me. So you can see it's made it such that this line here is exactly 80 characters long. Just want to show that to you because that saves you a lot of time when you're actually trying to write code according to the PEP8 style guideline, and it will fix other things for you as well, not just line length. All right, so now that I've covered the auto formatter, we'll start getting into the PEP8 guideline more specifically. So the first thing you saw is that the maximum line length is 80 characters. So as soon as you get to 80 characters, you should go down to the next line. Technically, the maximum line length is 79 characters, but the last character on the line where you go down to the next one is the 80th character, right? And then the next important rule in the PEP8 style guideline is the indentation should be using spaces, and you should be using 4 spaces for all of your indentations. You can see down here, I have spaces and I have 4, and I am using spaces. So just make sure you indent using spaces and 4 spaces. A lot of editors actually indent using tab. It's fine if you indent using tab, but it can cause some issues and you can get some weird errors. So it's always preferable to use spaces and 4 spaces. All right, now moving forward, the rest of the rules that I'm going to show you here are typically considered the best practice and what you should use. However, there's always exceptions to these rules, and if they make your code less readable or they don't make sense to implement, then it's always fine to kind of ignore them and go with whatever style that you're using. Really, the most important thing when you're writing any code, not even just Python code, is whatever style you go with, it's consistent. So if you use single quotation marks for strings, always use single quotation marks for strings. If you're doing a space around your operators, always use a space around your operators. Just make sure that whatever you're doing is consistent. That's way more important than following the strict rules that I'm going to show you here. All right, so now what I want to do is get into naming. All right, so let's start with the naming convention for variables. So the naming convention for your just typical variables in Python is to use snake case or word_word convention case, whatever you want to call it. So what I mean by that is if you have a variable that is 2 words, sorry, this should be lowercase, then what you want is something like this, hello world, as opposed to something like this. This would be the incorrect case. This is camel case. Instead, you want to use snake case. This is probably the most common error I see in Python. People use camel case when they should really be using snake case for their variables. Now, some people will also do something like this. This is known as Pascal case. This is also incorrect. You don't want to do that for variables. Now, if you had a third word here, same thing. You would just separate again with another underscore. There you go. Simple. That's all you need to know for the naming convention for variables. Now, the naming convention for constants is to do all uppercases and then snake case. There's probably a name for this, but it looks something like this. So let's say you had a constant variable, you would name it like this. Notice it's highlighting in a different color. Now, a constant variable is a variable that stores a value that you do not expect to change in the program, and that really should not change in the program at all. So an example of a constant might be something like a color that you're going to use for styling your website or styling a game or something that's never going to change. In this case, again, you do it in all capitals, and then you would, put whatever the value of the constant is, and then this variable should never have its value changed. It should only ever just be used in the program as a constant. Now, there's not really a way to enforce that this is not going to be changed. In other programming languages, there is. But regardless, when you have a constant, you normally want to put this at the very top of the program below any import statements and then have it in all capitals. Now, if you had 2 words, you could do something like this, bg_color. This would be correct, standing for background color. You do it with an underscore in all capitals. And again, this goes at the top of your program below any import statements. Okay, so that is the naming convention for constants. Now, the naming convention for modules, that would be the actual Python file itself, is to have it all in lowercase. So you usually want 1 word, all lowercase, but if you do need to have multiple words, then you want to separate that with underscores. So just like you would name a variable, that's how you name your modules, except it's preferred that you just have 1 word and you don't have, multiple words. If you do have multiple words, separate them with underscores. Now, the naming convention for functions is the same as for variables. So if I have my hello, _world function, this is correct. You do not want to name a function hello world like that. Again, this isn't really incorrect. You can do it. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It just doesn't follow the Python convention. Okay, so that is functions. Now, lastly, we need to go over classes and exceptions. So when you name a class, you want this to be in Pascal case. That means an uppercase on the first word, uppercase on the second word, and you're having them kind of in camel case notation. So let me just type it out and you'll see what I mean. Let's name this base class or something. This is what you want. So you want a capital on the first word, no underscore, and a capital on the second word, and that's how you name a class. Okay, pretty straightforward. And then if you just had one word, you would just do it like that. Now, whenever you name an exception, same thing, you want it to be in Pascal case. Now, the reason for that is an exception is a class in Python, and so it should have the same naming convention. So if you were to create an exception, let's just say, you know, this is called base exception or something. I think that's actually a built-in class in Python. Let's just call this X exception. Then you would name it like this. Hopefully that makes sense. But that's really all of the important naming conventions in Python that you need to know. All right, so the next thing that I want to cover here is just some parameter naming conventions related to methods in classes. So let's say we have a class, we can call this class test, and let's say we have a test method, and this method is an instance method, then the first parameter for this method should be named self. So a lot of people know this, and they probably actually think you have to name this self, but technically I could name this S, I could name this inst or something, whatever. You can name that whatever I want. It will still work. It will still hold the instance the method was called on, but by convention, it should always be named self. So again, the first parameter in an instance method should always be named self. Now, in the same way, if you have a class method, so let's go at class method like that, and then we define, I don't know, let's go CLS underscore method, the first parameter here should be named CLS. So again, a convention, first parameter of any class method should be named CLS, standing for class. There you go, simple enough. Okay, so that was all I need to cover for this. Just make sure you use self and CLS as your first parameter values for class and for instance methods. All right, so the next convention I have for you has to do with spacing out classes, methods, and functions. Again, people mess this up all of the time. Even if you decide not to follow these rules, just make sure you stay consistent with how you decide to space these out. So let's define a few classes here and functions and methods so I can show you what I mean. So let's have our class foo, and let's define an init. Okay, and we can just do a pass in here. Let's define a, I don't know, foo method, and let's do a pass inside of here. Okay, let's define a function. We'll call this bar, and let's do a pass. All right, so this is what I have right here. Now, any top level functions or classes should be separated by two blank lines. So what I mean by that is that this is correct. You want to separate your classes with two spaces here, or two blank lines, and then same thing here with the function. Now, the reason for this is these are in the top level meaning kind of furthest left indentation level. These are all global to this file, and so that means you space them out with two blank lines. However, methods inside of a classes are spaced out with one blank line. So that's really all you need to know here. Just make sure all of your functions and all of your classes, let's just do another one here, have two lines in between them if they're in the top level. If they're nested inside of something, then that might change. And if you have methods here inside of a class, you separate them with one line. All right, so next I'm going to talk about imports. Now, imports should always go at the very top of your file, unless there's some specific exception and some reason why you can't import something at the very top of your file. But you always want all of your imports at the top of the file, and they're just on the next line from each other. So let me show you what I mean. You have something like import OS, import SYS. This is correct. You've imported things properly. Now, you can actually import things on the same line, so import OS and import SYS, but this is not the Python convention, and PEP8 says you should not do this. So I should not import two distinct modules on the same line. I should split them into two lines like this. And again, top of your program. Now, the exception is that if you're going to be importing things from a module, you can import multiple of them on the same line. So maybe I say from OS, import path, and import, I don't know, stat or something. I don't know what other thing I would import from OS. But you get the idea. This is fine because I'm importing two things from one individual module, and so I can import them on one line. That is okay. You don't need to do something like from OS import, if I can type this, stat like that. Okay, so that is kind of the basic rules with import. Now, one more important thing is you should not use the wildcard import. So what I mean by that is you shouldn't do something like from OS import asterisk. That is incorrect. You shouldn't do that. This is just not good to use because this will import everything and it doesn't clearly define what parts of OS you're actually going to be using in your program. So just avoid this if you can. All right, so one more important note here. The only time when you're not going to have your import statements, and let me change this to a proper import statement at the top of your program, is if you have a module docstring. So if you have a module docstring, this is a string that describes what's in this Python module, then your imports can go after that. Otherwise, they're going to go at the very top of the program. And then after your imports, you're usually going to have any of your globally defined variables and constants, and then any of your top level functions and classes. All right, so now I'm going to cover strings and specifically what type of quotation marks you can use. So this is a big issue in Python as well, and I'm very guilty of doing this. But in Python, the single and double quotation marks are completely equivalent. And there actually is no preference on whether you use the single or the double quotation marks. The only rule is if you use double quotation marks, you should always use double quotation marks. And if you use single quotation marks, you should always use single quotation marks. The only exception to that would be if you need to actually embed a single or double quotation mark inside of a string. So it's preferential if you want to put a double quotation mark inside of a string that you wrap the string in single quotation marks. So if I actually wanted to say something like hello double quotation mark for some reason, then I would put that inside of single quotation marks. And in the other way around, if I wanted to use a single quotation mark, then I would wrap that inside of double quotation marks. Now that is opposed to doing this. So you can actually use an escape character in Python to escape this quote such that this string is maintained, but it's preferred to just wrap with the opposite quotation marks rather than using an escape character, although sometimes you do need to use the escape character. So that's kind of the rule with quotation marks. Just be consistent on whatever set you decide to use. Doesn't matter if you use single or double. There is no preference in the style guideline. However, when you are writing a docstring or a triple quoted string like this, you should always use double quotation marks. Don't know why that's a thing. I would have imagined you could use single or double as long as you're consistent, but it says you should always use double quotation marks whenever you're writing a triple quoted string. All right, so next I'm going to talk about the incorrect usage of white spaces. So I'm just going to paste a bunch of examples here and then show you what I mean on the incorrect usage of white spaces. So let's look at this one, for example. We have some functions spam, ham, indexing 1, and then we're creating some dictionary here. This is correct. You do not want to have white spaces between a bracket, brace, parenthesis, whatever it may be, and whatever comes after that. So looking at this, this would be incorrect. You do not want to have spaces like this. You can see all of the white spaces showing up. Just don't do that. Make everything look like this. All right, the next example is this. You do not want to have white spaces between a trailing comma and a closing parenthesis. So if you have something like this, you want to leave it like this, right? You don't want to have a space between the trailing comma and the closing parenthesis. The next situation in which you do not want to have a white space is right here. So you do not want to have a white space in between a function call or in between something and an opening parenthesis followed by arguments to some call. So whether this is a function, whether this is a class, doesn't matter. You don't want to have this, so don't separate your arguments from the actual call that you're making. This is the correct way that you should call a function, initialize a class, whatever it may be. All right, so this is the next example of white space usage that you want to know. The first thing to note here is when you're declaring a variable, you always want to have at least one space on each side of the equal sign. So this is correct. Notice this is incorrect, right? Because we don't have any spaces on each side of the equal sign like that. Now, another thing is when you're using an operator like the plus sign or the minus sign, typically you are going to want to have spaces on either side of this operator. The only time in which you shouldn't have that is when you're trying to show the precedence of operators. Then you can actually kind of jam the operands together with the operator. Seems a little bit weird, but have a look at this example right here. So in this situation, it's fine to have a plus b and a minus b because you're trying to show that these happen before the multiplication. So that's the only time when it's okay to kind of mess with the spacing here is when you're going to try to show the precedence of operators. Now, when you're using the multiplication sign, same thing. It's fine to have two things squished together here because we're trying to show that these are going to happen before the addition operation. Okay, when you're using something like plus equals or minus equals, you want one space on each side of this operator. And when you are using any operation, you want the same amount of space on each side of the operator. So something like this is no good because I have no space here and one space here. So whatever you do, just make sure it's consistent. You should always have the same number of spaces on the left and right hand side of any operator. Now, if you're looking at this, this is considered incorrect. First of all, because you don't have the same number of spaces and you should always have one space here. This one is considered incorrect because you're not properly showing the precedence of operators. I make this mistake all the time, but you should do x times 2 minus 1. Same thing here. You're not correctly showing the precedence of operators, so you should do that and that. And then this one, you could argue whether it's incorrect or not, but again, it wants you to do this to show the precedence of the operators. All right, so the next example here kind of contradicts what I just showed you, but this is specific to white spaces in the default value for parameters in a function or for arguments. So this is correct. The reason this is correct is because you do not want any white spaces on the left or right-hand side of the equal sign when you're defining the default value of a parameter. Same thing when you are calling a function with default values, or sorry, you're assigning keyword arguments. That's what I meant to say. You want to make sure you don't have any spaces. So you can see why this is incorrect here. We would need to remove the spaces in all of these for this to now follow the PEP8 style guide. All right, so now I'm going to talk to you about inline comments. This is super simple, but these are things, again, that people mess up a lot. I'm just going to paste in an example here so you can see this is correct and this is incorrect. So an inline comment is a comment that goes on the same line as some expression, variable, whatever. In this case, this is correct because we have at least 2 spaces between the line and the comment. The comment has at least 1 space between the pound sign and what the actual content of the comment is, and the comment starts with an uppercase. So that is kind of the rules for an inline comment. At least 2 spaces between it and whatever the expression is on that line. 1 space after the pound sign, and then you want it to start with a capital unless it doesn't make sense to have it start with a capital. Now, this is wrong because we only have 1 space here. We don't have a space between the pound sign, and then if we want to be even more wrong, we could do this. This would need to be a capital. To make this correct, we would need it to look like this. So again, these rules aren't super strict, but just make sure you're consistent with however you're doing your inline comments. If you only do 1 white space, that's fine, but just make sure you always only do 1 white space. All right, so the next convention I have for you is a quick one, but this has to do with checking if a value is none. So a lot of times what people will do to check if some variable is none is they'll do the following. If x like that. Now, this is fine. This will actually tell you if x is equal to none, but it will also tell you if x is false. So this is why you want to be explicit if you're checking if a variable is equal to none, because if I do something like x equals false, this if statement will still trigger. If I do something like x equals 0, it will still trigger. If I do something like x is equal to an empty string, this will still trigger. And so if you only want to check if the value of x is equal to none, then you should say if x is none like that. Now, it's important that you do is none and not double equals none. This is just another rule. You want to make sure you're never checking if something is equal to none using double equal signs. You want to use is. So that's kind of the only rule here. When you're checking equivalence with none, be explicit and use is none as opposed to double equals none. All right, so the next convention here is pretty simple, but if you are trying to check if the value of something is not something, then you want to use is not is. Now, this is not specific to checking the value none. You could check, let's just say like x. This would be the exact same thing. And let me just make sure I use the same quotation marks here. You want to make sure you're using is not is. Now, these will actually give you the exact same result. It's just the convention to use is not. Now, the reason I'm saying that it'll give you the same result, even though it looks like it won't, is because the not is going to be applied to foo is x, not to foo. So it's not going to negate foo and then check not foo is x. So it won't do this. What it will actually do is this, okay? So it is the same result, but you just want to make sure you're using is not. All right, so the next convention here is really simple, has to do with a try and except block. And really, the only thing you need to know here is you should always accept a specific exception. A lot of people don't do this. I don't do this all of the time. In fact, all of the rules that I've stated here, I've broken at some point in time, but you always want to make sure you're accepting a specific exception, not doing an empty except block like this. Now, there's a bunch of different reasons why that's the case. I won't really get into them, but just make sure you're almost always accepting a specific exception. And if you need to accept multiple specific exceptions, then do another except like this. Don't just do an empty except block like that. All right, so this is actually our last convention or rule right here. And this is if you are trying to check if a string starts with or ends with something, you should use the dot starts with or dot ends with as opposed to using a string slice. So these are just better. These are apparently supposed to be more accurate and more performant than using a slice. And so that's the reason why you're supposed to use them. This is weird. I didn't know about this at all. This is one of the main things that I was like, whoa, okay, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that before. So just check, or not check, use starts with or ends with, as opposed to using a string slice when you want to check the prefix or suffix of a string. So with that said, that's pretty much going to wrap up this video. Again, I only covered a small subset of the PEP8 guideline. Just wanted to go through what I thought was kind of the most interesting, most important, and commonly mistaken stuff in Python. Hopefully you guys found some value from this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in another one.